Good evening, each and everyone. Welcome to our branch meeting, the Algoa Midlands branch meeting here. We are quite excited to host this video with this webinar with you guys tonight. We are still waiting for a few participants. So we're just going to give that a little bit more time, and before long we'll get started. So we're just waiting on a few more people, and then we'll get this started. Thanks for your patience. All right, so I do think that we're going to kick off the evening tonight. So I would like to welcome you to the Algoa Midlands SADA webinar, our CPD event. It's the second event for the online CPD events, and we're quite excited to host you guys tonight. I would like to thank SciVision and VATEC SA for sponsoring our guest speaker tonight. And without further ado, I would like to introduce our guest speaker to you guys tonight, and that will be Mr. Dawie Ruet. And he doesn't need any introduction because he's widely known for his informative reviews of the economy. He's the chief economist of the Efficient Group Limited, and is also the chairman of the Efficient Financial Service. He has held the position of the executive director of Efficient Group since November 2006, and is nationally known for his expertise in the government, finance, and monetary policies. He has an extensive network of economic experts in his knowledge group and likes to share his opinion on current affairs. He is known for his good public speaking skills and has already presented more than 1,000 box office and radio programs. He's also well qualified with a master's degree in economics, which he has obtained with distinction. His first book on tax issues was published in 2013 under the title Tax, Lies and Red Tape, which offered a tongue-in-the-cheek look at the country's economy. His economic expertise spans 2 decades and also includes his 9 years as an economist at the Reserve Bank. His comfortable style of presenting makes it easy for all of us to understand all those difficult economic concepts. As if Dawie does not already have enough hay on his fork, he's as an MBA lecturer and a presenter of economics as a subject at University of Pretoria, the Gordon Institute of Business Sciences. Dawie is also a co-presenter on the hit breakfast show on Byt Sake on Cape Net every Sunday morning. We look forward to your presentation, Dawie. Thank you very much. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Van Zyl. Thank you very much. And before I get going, I first have to thank SADA, the South African Dental Association, for this invite. And I specifically have to thank Peter from SciVision. Thank you very much, Peter. It was really nice meeting you and your team. You were very friendly and very nice to me. And I have to thank also my dentist, Dr. Neil de Beer, for, well, checking my teeth and everything that goes with that. And I must tell you, I am absolutely amazed about the technological advancements that has been happening in the recent years. So I just want to share my screen with you because there are a couple of things. I just want to make sure, can you see my screen?
Not yet.
Not yet. All right, let me just make sure about this. I just want to share my screen because I want to show you a couple of slides. And that I think it's important for all of us to see. And I'm having some difficulties sharing my screen. I'm sure we will be able to sort that out pretty soon. In the meantime, I just want to make one or two comments perhaps, and I'm just going to close that one. And that is that you did mention that I presented a number of TV programs, and I want to close off my talk tonight by actually telling you about the first TV program that I have presented, which was an absolutely nerve-wracking experience. But that all I will leave to the end of this presentation. Okay, let me just see if I can do it now. If I can share my screen with you, because that's quite important to share the screen with you. I tested it beforehand, and as always, these sort of things go wrong when they're not supposed to be going wrong. Yeah. That's it, share screen. For some weird reason, I still cannot share my screen. So I can do the presentation, I can do the talk without actually sharing my screen, which will be a bit of unfortunate, but it doesn't really matter. I can still do my talk. So if it's happy, if there's happiness all around, I will still do my presentation, but I will do that without actually sharing my screen. Oh, there it is. Got it. Okay, just confirm to me if you can see my screen.
Yes, that's good.
All right, yeah. Cool. Get going. Thank you very much. There it is. All right. So what you see there is actually not my legs. So that's somebody else's legs, but I thought of starting off with that. And I'm the economist at the company called the Efficient Group. The Efficient Group is a company responsible for in the financial services industry. And my responsibility is to look after people's money primarily. I am the economist, and my job as an economist is to try to identify certain trends internationally and locally, and try to assist our asset managers in the composition and the allocation of resources within those portfolios. So some of my colleagues tell me, they say that I don't really have a job. I'm a philosopher, and I'm getting paid for doing nothing. So that's some of my colleagues, what they say. But let me get going, and maybe I can make one or two comments. And I think this is very important. Starting point is that we as South Africans, we have to understand where we fit in the rest of the world. Now, the rest of the world is quite a complicated place, and the subject called economics used to be called the political economy. And there's a very good reason for that, because politics, to a large extent, affects economies. So let's get going with politics internationally, and I'm going to talk a lot about politics in South Africa as well. But internationally, what we have been seeing in recent years is a move. It's not necessarily to the right, but it certainly is a move to new nationalism. And there are many examples of new nationalism internationally. For example, Brexit, the Brits leaving the European Union, is an example of new nationalism. The best example in the world, perhaps, is Donald Trump himself with America First. That's an example of new nationalism. Some other examples is Jair Bolsonaro in Brazil. They call him the tropical Trump. That's an example of new nationalism. And Modi in India is a good example of that. Duterte in the Philippines is another one. Putin, even Eastern Europe, is all many governments that certainly can qualify for the term new nationalists. And why this is important to understand is that when you have a new nationalist or nationalistic kind of governments in charge, what they quite often do is that they try to protect their local economies, or at least that is what the reason that they provide. In fact, what they're actually doing, they're undermining the global integration of economies. And in a weird kind of way, today what we are seeing is that this COVID virus or the measures that have been in place because of the COVID virus is doing pretty much what the trade friction of the trade war would have done if the new nationalists had their way. So that was a trend that was quite clear before the current pandemic. And I'm going to spend some time on the current pandemic and the effect thereof on the world economy and the local economy as well. So what the COVID virus has done, basically, it has, in a way, proved to us what would have happened if the trade war went the whole way. but it also showed us what is going to happen if this trend that we've witnessed the past 100 years, and the trend that we've witnessed the past 100 years was of an integration of the world economy, and the opposite is in fact happening. And this supply chains that have been established globally, that has been broken to a large extent. So the world economy currently experiencing a very, very deep recession, probably the worst that we've seen at least since the Great Depression. The world economy is contracting quite significantly. But we're also seeing, and it's important to understand that, is that debt levels internationally are at record high levels, especially government debt or state debt levels are at record high levels. And what we are also seeing is that monetary policy are at extremes. Now, there are two basic policy instruments available to the authorities. The one is fiscal policy, and fiscal policy is basically what politicians do. It has to do with taxes and state spending and state borrowing and the like. Monetary policy is what central banks do. And what the two characteristics of the current environment is that state debt levels are at record high levels, while monetary policy is exceptionally accommodative. And I'm going to spend a little bit of time on that because I think it's important to understand that. Maybe I should just make a side note and just to compare the current crisis in which the world finds itself with the 2008-2009 Great Recession and the differences between the two. The 2008-2009 crisis was basically an asset bubble or a property bubble that burst, and that resulted in a financial crisis, particularly a banking crisis. Currently, what we're seeing is we see a crisis in the world economy from the supply and demand side. The banks are actually came through quite unscathed in the current environment. Of course, eventually the banks will be affected as well, but it's quite different from a previous crisis whereby we have a crisis both on the supply and the demand side of the economy, and we did not witness the collapse of a specific asset bubble necessarily. All right, now this specific graph, it's a graph from the World Bank, and it just shows you in terms of global economic growth what can be expected. Now, during the Great Recession in 2008-2009, the world economy contracted by approximately 2%. What we are experiencing in the current environment is that the world economy is probably going to contract with approximately 5% or so. So we're talking about a significant and a huge contraction in the world production, a world economic contraction in economic terms. And of course, that will lead to all sort of difficulties for the population of the globe. I did say that I want to talk a little bit about monetary policy, and this is the Federal Reserve in the United States. It's a balance sheet or the assets of the Federal Reserve in the United States, and it gives us an indication of the kind of involvement of central banks in the world's financial markets. Now, the central banks, and they've done this previously as well, they've started doing it the past 10 years, but central banks initially, the idea of a central bank is that they literally make money. They make money and provide the money to the economy. And then if the economy or the private sector make this money more through the credit process or the money creation process, but the first step in money creation happens with the central bank putting money into the system. Remember that central banks today do not use the gold standard anymore. They can literally make money out of nothing. And that money is called so-called fiat money. Now, this is the balance sheets of the Federal Reserve in the United States. And what central banks typically do when the economy is going into a slowdown phase is they will cut interest rates to very low levels. And that's indeed what central banks have done. But not only did they cut interest rates to low levels, in some instances, they've reduced interest rates to below zero. So they've done that already. That is the orthodox or the conventional way of applying monetary policy, cut short-term interest rates. But what this graph shows you is what the Federal Reserve in the United States, how many financial assets, primarily government debt instruments, they bought during the crisis in 2008. And you can quite clearly see how many assets they bought in 2008, 2009, and compare it to what they've done now. And you can see the Federal Reserve in the United States have hugely expanded their balance sheet. Let me put it in simple terms. The Federal Reserve in the United States have printed many, many trillions of American dollars, and they've used this money to buy government debt instruments in the United States. And it's not only the United States, many other central banks are doing exactly the same. And by the way, this is exactly the same reason why the gold price has been going up, because many analysts think that if you create so much money, money will lose its value. We call it inflation. And if money loses its value, things like the gold price is likely to go up. And that is certainly a potential threat to the world economy going forward. But the main point I want to make here is that interest rates in the world is at record low levels. And at the same time, central banks are making many, many billions and trillions of dollars available. And by using that, they use that to buy financial instruments. Maybe another side note, and that is that people that participate in the financial markets are people, usually wealthy people like you guys, for instance, and the central banks are supporting the financial markets, and the rich people are actually getting richer because most of this money, or a lot of this money, is going to financial assets, pushing financial assets up in value. And the poor people, people working in factories, people losing their jobs, do not necessarily participate in the financial markets to the same extent. And that means that they are not getting the benefits of a very expansionary monetary policy as what we are experiencing globally at the moment. This is just a graph showing you total debt levels globally. I'm not going to spend too much time on this. Suffice to say is that debt levels today internationally is the highest it's ever been. It's at least since after the Second World War. So debt levels, especially state debt levels or government debt levels, are at exceptionally high levels. There's a bit of a contradiction here. If you want to lend money, as an example, if you want to lend money to the German government, you have to pay the German government before you are allowed to lend the money. In the case of South Africa, if you want to lend money to the South African government, they will pay you 10%. But in the case of the Germans, you have to pay them. Interest rates in the German economy is below zero. Now, that is a real contradiction because debt levels are at record high levels, but at the same time, interest rates are in fact negative. All right. Now, I think, and this is something that I picked up when I visited Dr. De Beer, and I think what I'm going to say now is really important for the future of the global economy. And the future of the global economy became apparent before the COVID crisis. And that is that there were certain trends quite apparent, and certain trends simply got entrenched during this crisis. Now, one obvious trend is that if you analyze an economy, let me start from another point. When we start a new economy, say we all wash out on an island and there's nothing on an island, we will start off in the primary industries. That is in agriculture and in mining and so on. And from there on, we will move into the secondary industries, typically on the manufacturing. We will add value to whatever we've produced in the primary industries. And from there on, so where I produce wool, for example, in the primary industry, I will knit a jersey in the secondary industry. And from there on, I will sell the jersey in the tertiary industry. So that's typically how economies evolve over time. If you analyze the successful and the wealthy economies in the world, most of the economic activity actually happens in the tertiary industry. That is where economic growth is happening. And the tertiary industry, of course, we know there are many examples of the tertiary industry, but the tertiary industry consists mostly of services. Do not think that primary industries, like, for example, agriculture, is always locked into the primary industry. Quite often you will find that industries like, for example, or businesses in the agricultural or the primary industry actually leapfrog into the tertiary industry. A very good example is genetics. Genetics is actually part of agriculture in a way, and today genetics, for example, finds itself in the tertiary industry. That is how certain industries are actually migrating into the more advanced industries. Now, this is important because what we see is that the wealthy and successful economies are in the tertiary industry. The tertiary industry is primarily services orientated. It's important to understand that. And the services industry, especially those kind of industries that can be digitized, are the real winners here in future. And that's exactly what I saw when I visited Dr. De Beer, is that he's making use, he's a typical service provider, but he's making use of this high-tech technology that is currently available, and much of that can be digitized as well. So that is an example of a business that is part of the modern economy, and we're going to see much more of that in future. So in future, jobs and businesses of the future will be tertiary sectors, it will be service orientated, and it will be businesses that can be digitized. There are many examples that I'm pretty sure you all are aware of. For example, Google and Microsoft, and all those sort of services are typically businesses that find themselves in the tertiary industry, and much of that is digitizable. Now, the losers in this environment will be people with repetitive kinds of jobs in all industries. Even in your industry, by the way, there's algorithms available at the moment that is better in identifying certain cancers in dermatology, for example, better than the most experienced dermatologists. So that's an example where technology can get rid of very specialized jobs as well. But nevertheless, it's usually a repetitive kind of job in all the industries that will be on the losing side. Of course, people without the necessary skills will be in the losing side as well. And it's important to understand that there's a difference between and skills have to increase. And it's really part of the value chain will be on the losing side, while companies, if you do not have a connection, a typical connection like an internet connection, you will be on the losing side as well. The worst will be robots. Robots, like we saw in the first in the video, the start of this presentation, those will be some of the winners. And remember, robots are there to serve us. So it will be good for people that they can actually use robots, especially in the primary and the secondary industry, but also in the tertiary industries. There's certain algorithms, like for example, artificial intelligence will be everywhere. That's another winner. And skilled individuals will be people that will benefit from this new world in which we find ourselves. And companies that own the value chain will be the biggest winners compared to what we saw previously. Let me give you an example with what I mean with that. Some companies in the United States are actually moving their factories. They're bringing them back from Vietnam and from China and from Thailand and all those places. They're moving back to the United States because they can. They own the whole value chain, and that is the future for the world economy as well. All right. I just want to make a final comment here, and I'm not going to spend too much time on this. I did show you certain contradictions in some numbers globally, like debt levels are at record high levels, but at the same time, interest rates are very low. And I have a suspicion that economists are probably not analyzing the modern economy in the correct way. I think there's far more activity happening, and there's far better productivity growth than what we think. Let me give you one example. I did some calculations on my own personal productivity. I've got my cell phone here. This is my cell phone. And by using the cell phone, I at least doubled my own productivity. Let me give you another example. The value of Google, we all use Google. The value of Google per individual has been calculated at roughly about $500 annually. And that is not included in any economic aggregate numbers in the figures of the United States, as an example. So without a doubt, Googling must have some value, but it's not included in any economic numbers anywhere. So perhaps the world economy is in fact much bigger than what we actually think. And economists actually debate amongst themselves on what should be included in GDP or in the economy and what should not be included. Okay, coming to the South African economy, and a few things that I will be looking at when I talk about the South African economy. But it certainly is some of the things that most economists are talking about now at the moment has to do with the budget of the Minister of Finance recently. He did present a so-called emergency budget or an interim budget. And this budget is going to be a so-called zero-based budget. It's a zero-based budget because they want to start everything from scratch. And that is unlike what we've had up to now, because up to now we've had a so-called rolling budget. A rolling budget is simply where 1 year is, the next year is budgeted on top of the previous year. So the Minister of Finance, because of the extent of the fiscal crisis is the debt crisis. I'm going to show you some numbers in South Africa. It's important for us to really to start the whole thing afresh and from anew. A second point that is important is that to ask the question, is this a left-leaning budget or a right-leaning budget? And the answer to that is, it's still a left-leaning budget, but Tito Mboweni, without a doubt, is trying to change the trajectory of the budget and move it a bit away from a totally unsustainable trend that we have established the past 10 years or so. And then a couple other questions that I would need to try to answer in this, and that has to do with how we're going to fund the COVID relief fund and how we're going to fund the revenue shortfall and so on. And I want to end off with politics because that is the interesting part. I just want to make a very important comment, and that is that the virus has probably just about no impact on the South African economy or on the world economy. The impact is not because of the virus. The impact has to do with the measures that have been put in place to contain the virus. Now that's important to understand, because these measures that have been put in place to contain the virus will have a huge impact on economic activities. And we have to be very, very sure about implementing these measures, and we have to be very careful about implementing these measures because the impact on the economy is going to be really, really massive. Now, here are some numbers that I think are important. Firstly, we all have to understand that the South African economy was in very deep trouble before this crisis. The state finances was totally unsustainable. We were in a recession before this, a so-called technical recession. The past 5 years, we have been getting poorer, the average South African. We were in crisis before this. And what we have now is a crisis on top of a crisis. Now, here are some of my estimates and some of my calculations. I expect the economy to contract by approximately 10% this year. Now, we have never seen such sort of economic contraction in the history of South Africa. A contraction in economic performance of 10% is really, really big. That means that the average South Africans per capita GDP or your income will fall by nearly 15%. So the average South African out there will be 15% poorer than last year. The number of job losses, permanent job losses by the end of this year is likely to be around about 2 million, or in fact, a little bit more than 2 million. We will lose at least 100,000 businesses that will close down permanently. Now, I've done some calculations, and I don't want to really make estimates about the possible deaths of the COVID-19, but the worst case scenario of what I've seen on estimates on the possible deaths because of this virus does not get to 50,000. So in a really, really bad case scenario, given the current mortality rates that have been witnessed in other countries, we are going to see fewer deaths than 50,000 people dying in South Africa. What people do not understand is that the biggest killer out there is not COVID-19. It is not diabetes. It is, in fact, poverty. Poverty kills more people than all these other bad things put together. And I've calculated if the per capita GDP in South Africa falls by 15% this year, and it will take us at least 10 years to get back where we were last year. But if per capita GDP falls by 15%, people that's going to die because of poverty, we will have approximately 300,000 people that's going to die over the next 10 years because of the increase in poverty. And remember, poverty means that an ambulance can't get you on time because there are potholes. Poverty means that there are not tires available to put on the ambulance. Poverty means that people are not properly educated to treat somebody that is sick. Poverty means that all these sort of things will affect everybody, and in the end, it affects life expectancy as well. Quite clearly, we'll see, for instance, that the life expectancy in European countries are well in excess of 80 years, while in the case of South Africa, it's just over 60 years. So there's a difference of approximately 20 years, and you find it all over the world. The poverty correlates with everything that is bad, crime, dependency on all sort of things, on bad education, on bad health services and the like, while wealth correlates with everything that is good, like life expectancy, good education, good infrastructure, and everything like that. So poverty is going to kill more people over the next 10 years than the people that will die because of this. Now, a couple of things that America were concerned about. The Minister of Finance did not announce any prescribed assets. Let me just give you a background on what it means, what a prescribed asset is. A prescribed asset is whereby you force certain saving industries, like, for example, pension funds, to invest a certain portion of their assets into certain investments, like, for example, to lend money to Eskom or to lend money to South African Airways. Now, that has not been proposed yet, but I'm pretty sure if you look at the numbers, it is inevitable. We're probably going to see prescribed assets pretty soon. Now, prescribed assets is something that I believe will be announced within the next couple of, perhaps the next year or so. In fact, that has been mooted by the ANC themselves, although they did not suggest that it will be prescribed enforced investments, but they did say that they would like to make use of the assets of pensions funds, invest in certain things, like, for example, Eskom. Maybe at this junction, I just should mention something. Now, what we're currently seeing in South Africa is a movie that has played itself out in many countries in the world. And there's a certain sequence that these sort of things happen. Now, I've written of Tolstoy, and he's written, and one of my claims to fame is that I actually read the book Anna Karenina by Leo Tolstoy. It's a very, very thick book. It took me forever to read this. And the book starts off by saying is that all happy families are happy in the same way, but all unhappy families are unhappy in their own ways. But there's something that is clear, is that unhappy countries are unhappy in the same way, and it happens basically on the following. First of all, you get politicians that keep on taxing the taxpayers until you run out of taxpayers. And we've done that The second is capital, and inflation. Not yet. In fact, inflation is likely to remain fairly low because of Lesetja Kganyago being the governor of the South African Reserve Bank, and he's doing a really excellent job. He's probably the best governor we've ever had. But eventually, the pressure on the Reserve Bank will simply build up, and eventually that even the South African Reserve Bank will fall over. And that is where prescribed assets come in. Prescribed assets is basically an attempt by the politician by basically stealing the savings of especially pensioners. Will we get a wealth tax in South Africa? I don't think, not soon anyway. I don't think we will see a wealth tax in South Africa soon because of practical reasons. It's very difficult to implement that, and it takes years. But I do foresee a so-called solidarity tax by the Minister of Finance next year. So expect the so-called solidarity tax, a once-off tax, especially on wealth. And of course, when we get about these sort of things out of the country, and eventually that means that foreign exchange regulation will be tightened in South Africa as well. In my job, I manage the assets of clients locally and internationally, and I'm a relatively small business, and in my business, I take huge amounts of money out every month out of South Africa. That is my advice to my clients. Make sure you have a substantial portion of your assets invested abroad. The national health insurance, will it become a reality? And the answer to that is they are going to try. But I do not think the NHI will become a reality. And here are my reasons. First of all, we really do not have
Davi, sorry to interrupt.
So there's simply.
Davi, sorry
Yes,
to
I can hear you.
interrupt. Your sound is quite poor. Could you just disable your video and present without? We are missing quite a chunk of your talk. I'm really sorry about that. Thank you.
No problem. Let me just see if I can switch off my video. I'm just going to stop sharing for a moment. Let me just switch off my video like that and see share again.
Sorry, Darby, is it possible to ask a question?
You're welcome to ask a question, ma'am.
Just not a question on your content. I'm Dr. Yvette Solomons, and one of the hosts, just to ask that you probably revert back to prescribed assets, because that's when we lost you. Just totally interrupted, just judging from all the comments coming from the floor, please. Thank you.
Okay, ma'am, I will do that. I think that is where I am now. All right, just a couple of comments. Is that
it's still not going well. Still not going well. Noma, have you got a solution?
He can leave the meeting and rejoin. Sometimes it improves.
Okay. All right. Darby, is it possible that we can ask you to just disconnect and to reconnect again, please, to see if it will improve, because it's very interrupted. Thank you. Just apologies.
Okay, that's it. How's that? Is that better?
Okay, that sounds much better. Thank you, Darby.
Okay, cool. I've reconnected. All right, I've reconnected to that. Can you just give me feedback? Can you hear me fine now?
Yes, it's fine. I think if you just keep your video off, let's try without the video then. Thank you so much.
All right, is that okay? Just interrupt me again and I'll try to connect to another connection.
Sure, we'll do that.
Okay, prescribed assets. Prescribed assets is something that needs to happen eventually. It will happen. And I did tell the story about Anna Karenina and Leo Tolstoy, and basically politicians eventually they run out of taxpayers, they run out of cash. Then they will start dipping into the savings of the savers, especially pension funds, and eventually this whole thing will end up in very high inflation. But fortunately for South Africa, we have somebody with the name of Lesetja Kanyage doing an excellent job at the South African Reserve Bank. So inflation is not going to be a problem, not a problem yet. I do expect the Minister of Finance to introduce a wealth tax.
I have to interrupt you, Darby. I have to interrupt you. It's breaking up again, please. Apologies.
This is going to be
complications.
no problem. Okay. How's that? How's this connection?
Okay, come back again, please. Thank you, Darby.
Okay, I just want to see. It's another connection. Is this better?
Yes, please proceed.
Okay, just tell me again if there's a problem.
Yeah, we will tell you. I will definitely give you a cue. Thank you.
Okay. All right, off I go. So that's it on taxes. On forex controls, I believe that the Minister of Finance will introduce some sort of forex controls eventually. It is inevitable. If people are starting, if you overtax people, they would like to take the money out of the country. And in my business, as an example, I take many millions of rands every month out of South Africa. And that's my advice to my clients. Take a large chunk of your portfolio out of South Africa. The NHI, I don't think the NHI will become a reality. I think they would like to introduce the NHI. There are a couple of reasons why I don't believe the NHI will become a reality. One is that we simply do not have money. A second and a very important reason is that many civil servants make use of the private sector, and if you make use of the private sector, they certainly wouldn't want to go to state hospitals. And a very important reason why I don't believe we're going to see the NHI is that if you have an incompetent government, they also are not good at implementing a bad idea. The South African Reserve Bank, without a doubt, pressure will build up on the South African Reserve Bank. There are already talk of nationalization of the Reserve Bank and changing the mandate of the Reserve Bank as well. The state-owned enterprises in South Africa have been run into the ground operationally and financially, and institutions like, for example, Eskom simply cannot survive without a massive financial injection, an additional injection. And I did mention inflation is likely to become a problem over time. I do not believe South Africa needs an IMF loan. And the reason for that is because we have sufficient reserves at the South African Reserve Bank. We do not need an IMF loan yet. I just have to explain something. When you go to the IMF, you borrow dollars, and you take the dollars to the South African Reserve Bank. The Reserve Bank converts that into rands, and the government will spend the rands in the economy, and the Reserve Bank will have to drain much of this liquidity out of the system again. And essentially what happens is that although the state may be borrowing money at only 1%, the Reserve Bank will have to essentially pay approximately 5 or 6% of that cost. So you're simply moving the cost to the South African Reserve Bank. But apart from that, we do not have dollars. We have sufficient dollars. This is a graph of the Minister of Finance, and this is the state debt trajectory. The state debt trajectory has become completely and totally unsustainable. And at this rate, you are going to get into very, very deep trouble. That is the dotted red line. The dotted gray line is what the Minister of Finance is trying to achieve. We want to reduce state spending and to stabilize state debt as a percentage of GDP. And this is the reason why we're in such deep trouble. The top line is state spending as a percentage of the economy, and the bottom line is state revenue or tax collections as a percentage of the economy. Now, as you can see, state spending has increased quite dramatically over the last couple of years, especially in this year. And the reason for the increase the last couple of years has to do with the fact that we've increased our spending on the wage bill on the civil servants. So we have been employing many civil servants, but also huge amounts of transfers to the state-owned enterprises. The bottom line is the revenue line or tax revenue, and that has come under tremendous pressure in recent years because the economy is simply not growing. So the gap between what they spend and what they get in, that's the amount of money that they need to borrow, and that's the reason why we see this, why we saw this massive increase in state spending. I don't want to spend too much time on these various taxes. If there are any questions on this, you're welcome to ask me later on. But the three most important taxes in South Africa are personal income tax. Personal income tax collections are significantly below budget, but less so than the other taxes. And the reason for that is that personal income taxes are mostly paid by wealthy individuals, while the people losing their jobs are actually mostly the middle income and the lower income categories. Value-added tax collections will be under tremendous pressure because people are not spending, because we have been locked down, but also because our income is under pressure. And company taxes are under tremendous pressure because approximately 100 companies in South Africa pay just about all the company taxes, and they do business locally and internationally, and that's the double whammy for companies in South Africa. I'm not talking even about the sin taxes and the fuel levy and all those. So all taxes are under tremendous pressure. So who should be blamed for all of this nonsense? Well, if you look at the presidents, the huge increase in state spending happened primarily while Zuma was the president. We see this huge increase in state spending now under the president because that has to do with two factors, the increase in state spending, but also because the economy is smaller. Remember, this is a ratio, spending to GDP. And if you look at the various ministers of finance, the minister of finance that was the minister of finance while things went really horribly bad was, of course, our dear Minister of Finance, Pravin Gordhan. So he is the minister, and of course, it wasn't all his fault, but he was there mostly as the Minister of Finance, and today he's the Minister of State-Owned Enterprises, and he is mostly responsible for this total disaster that what we are seeing at South African Airways, but also at Eskom and the other state-owned enterprises. This is how much money we spent on interest on state debt. Currently, nearly 22 cents of every rand that we pay to the state by way of taxes goes to service interest on state debt. And that is the single most important spending item that will keep on increasing. I'm not going to go too much into detail here, but essentially the Minister of Finance wants to cut back on state spending from this year to next year. I can tell you politically, it is nearly impossible to do. So although Tito Mboweni is the best that the ANC can offer, I do not believe he's got the necessary support to actually cut state spending. And I don't think he will be successful in reducing that upward trajectory of state debt as a percentage of GDP. This is just some technical numbers on the funding, where the number is going to come from. I'm not going to spend too much time on that unless there are some questions. Maybe I can just mention that in the current financial year, the state will borrow nearly 800 billion rand. Let me repeat that, 800,000 million rand. And much of that, 500 billion of that, will be spent on current expenditure. That's on salaries and other kinds of current expenditure. And basically, that is like borrowing money in your mortgage and spend that on a restaurant bill, for instance. And that means that you are dissaving or destroying capital. And the state will, in the current financial year, destroy approximately 500 billion rands worth of savings. This is South Africa's per capita GDP. Like I've said, we were in crisis beforehand. And for the previous 5 years, the South African economy has been contracting on a per capita basis. And we will see a massive collapse in state revenue during this year, bringing us back to where we were last during 1981. We have lost 40 years in terms of per capita GDP. Let me skip that. But let me get to some fun stuff, and that is politics. Now, what we have in South Africa is a government that is hugely, I'm going to exit now so that you can, I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and I will put on my video, see if everybody is happy with that. Let me just get an indication. Can you see me?
Yes, we can see you, Davi.
Fine. Okay, just tell me if you get a problem with my video and I'll switch it off again. So we have to understand that we have a government in South Africa. The ANC government is a hugely destructive government. They've done immense damage to the South African economy, and it's for various reasons. And I've identified 3 issues that I think that will be resolved over the next couple of, in fact, perhaps even the next couple of days, but probably over the next couple of weeks and the next, say, a couple of months or so. And the 3 issues are the following. And I advise people to get a very comfortable chair somewhere, make yourself comfortable, get a big bowl of popcorn, get a big jug of hot chocolate, and sit back and enjoy the show, because the show will be on the following items. The first one is that we need a leadership conflict in the ANC. We do not know who is in charge of the ANC. The president is not a very strong president. He has been elected with a tiny majority, as we all know. But the president, the personality of the president is that he's a consensus-seeking president. And we can't have a consensus-seeking president in a current environment. We need a strong leader that's prepared to lead. That is not the president. Apart from that, there are all sort of different messages that we're getting from the ANC. Ace Magashule, for example, keep on saying all sort of silly things. The Minister of Finance, Tito Mboweni, recently did say, and this is a very good example, that he's not going to provide money to South African Airways, but Pravin Gordhan insists that the government will get the money from somewhere. I don't know where they're going to get the money from, but the president says nothing. So I think what we're going to see is that there will be some sort of leadership conflict, and the sooner that happens, the better. We must know who is in charge. The second conflict is an ideological conflict. Now, what we've seen in the recent years is a government that simply got bigger and bigger. Tax burden just went up and up. The debt burden just went up and up, and that's become completely and totally unsustainable. We know, we hear all sort of words like, for example, exploitation, national democratic revolution, and redistribution, those sort of words. Those are all words used by the left or by socialists or by communists. So we don't really understand what the ideological direction of our political leadership is. We need that to be resolved as well. The second, and I think we're probably going to see something on that pretty soon. And the third conflict that needs to be resolved is a conflict between whoever is in charge of the ANC and organized labor, especially COSATU, because we have to cut back on the wage bill of the civil servants. That's what we need to do. And sit back and enjoy, because we need to get some answers on that. In the meantime, the South African economy is in very deep trouble. It's not all bad news. And I'm getting close to the end. It's not all bad news. The South African Reserve Bank is in excellent, competent hands. The press in South Africa is very, very independent. The judiciary in South Africa is very independent. But it could have been so much better if we had a competent and a government that is not what we have. Sorry?
No, you're good.
Okay. Can I go on? Okay. And on an individual basis, maybe I can end off by saying one or two things. My advice to people is that you have to be on top of what is happening in the country. So make sure that you know what is going on. Make sure you gather as much information as possible. And depending on what industry you are in, make sure that you can identify those risks in your particular industry. And of course, you have to manage those risks. And a very important risk simply has to do with cash flow. And people ask me, should I immigrate? And the answer to that is no, not necessarily. Because it doesn't matter where you are. If you're part of the modern economy, all you need is to be physically safe. All you need is to have the proper skills to participate in this modern economy. And skills mean that you have to know how to use the technology. And thirdly, you have to have a proper connection, better than what I have here. And maybe, if I may, can I just end off by telling you a personal story? Because I think we all are looking for a high place to jump off of after what I've just told you about the South African economy. Now, I have presented nearly 2,000 radio programs. I have presented probably more than 1,000 TV programs. And 2 or 3 years ago, I ran over a frozen lake in the northern part of Siberia. Now, why am I telling you this? And I've done some other funny things as well. I've done a couple of Ironman. I've ran the Comrades twice and a couple of other marathons and so on. Let me just make it very clear, I'm not a good sportsman, but I've done these sort of things. And what has that got to do with TV? Let me tell you the story. I can remember one day I was doing some commentary about the financial markets on the radio station. And I went into the studio, and the presenter had some issues with his car and he couldn't make it. And the only person that could present this program was me, and I presented it and I could actually do that. And one day I got a call from a TV station, and they asked me if I would be prepared to do a presentation or to present a television program. And of course I said yes immediately. Now let me give you a bit of an idea what happened that day to me. And this is, I learned a very, very important lesson. What happened to me that day, I went into the studio. Those of you that's been into the TV studio will recognize what I'm going to tell you now. There are a number of TV cameras, at least 3, sometimes as many as 5. A number of cameramen, of course. You get a floor manager. You get people doing the makeup for you. You got people running around doing things like, for example, the lights, and people doing stuff that I don't know what they are doing. Then there's a glass partition, and behind the glass partition are the important people. There's a guy shouting at everybody. He's in charge of the whole everything that is happening there. And then, of course, there are people doing the mixing, putting your name strap below you, for instance. People doing the sound, people playing in the videos, whatever needs to happen. So there are many more people behind that. You as a presenter will have a little earpiece in your ear, and there in front of the camera, there's what we call an auto cue that you have to read off certain stuff if you need to do that. Above the door of the studio, there are 3 lights, a green one saying you're off air, an orange one saying you're going to go on air, and a red one telling everybody that you actually are on air. On top of all these cameras are lights as well. And the camera with the red light, that is the camera on which you are on at that moment. And that also tells you that you are on air on that specific camera. So that's more or less what it looks like. I can remember going in there and doing my preparation, talking to all the important people through my earpiece, and feeling a little bit uneasy, but I thought I could do that. And gradually, as the time gets closer and closer, eventually the orange light will go on top of the door, and then the red light went on, and then I could hear people started counting in my ear. And they asked me, first of all, Davy, are you ready? I said, I'm ready. We're going to go live on air. We're going to go in 10 seconds. 10, 9, 8, And that moment, I died 1,000 deaths. And I was so angry at myself. Why did I say yes to doing this? I mean, what went through my head? You can't do this. You're not, I mean, on TV, 6, and then it went quiet. And the floor manager was standing in front of me with his hand up, 5, showing me 5, 4, 3, 2. And then the red light came on the camera. In that moment, I realized my mother is watching me. And that was very tough, that first couple of seconds, saying the first couple of words. And then suddenly I realized I can do this. And then it became really fun. And that's why I ran the marathon. That's why I've done many marathons. That's why I've done the Ironman and the Comrades. And I'm planning to do all sort of stupid and other silly things because I want to see if I can do that. So if I can leave you with one message, is that do stuff that you don't think you will be able to do, and you will be absolutely amazed on those things that you can do. Thank you very much for listening to me. If there are any questions, I will be more than happy to take those.
Thank you very much, Davy. We really appreciated your presentation. I'm going to give over to Dr. Yvette Solomons, and we do have a few questions that was noted down, and she will then facilitate the questions towards you, and then we'll continue after that. Over to you, Dr. Solomons.
Thank you, Dr. JP van Zyl.
Dr. Solomons, you're muted.
Oh, better now?
That's it.
Better,
Can you hear me?
yes.
Can you hear me? Okay. Thank you, Dr. van Zyl. And thank you, Mr. Davy Rood, for an excellent presentation. I think, wow, we are so, we challenged with truths, etc. And of course, it doesn't spell everything very positively, so to speak, but you've given us hope at the end. You've inspired. So even though you give us the facts, you're telling us that there is hope. In other words, we can change our focus. We can, in actual fact, then try to focus our energies on where it matters, because there are certain things that we do not have control over. But we can control those things that we have control over and certainly make little differences. So I'm going to jump straight into some of the questions, and most of them that I can see here are targeting and are actually addressing you. I have one that says the president said that SARS would not add interest on payments due to SARS from businesses like pay as you earn, VAT, during the lockdown stage. Yet SARS is still adding interest to accounts. Can you give us any guidance on this matter, please?
Yes, okay. A number of measures have been put in place by the fiscal authorities and also by the monetary authorities in order to support, of course, the South African economy. Some of the measures that have been put in place is the postponement of the payment of certain taxes. And that means that you're still going to need to pay those taxes, but as far as I'm aware, you will not be required to pay an interest on those taxes if you are late to that. But I have a suspicion that you need to actually apply to SARS to get a postponement of those taxes. And if you haven't applied to SARS, then interest may be levied on that. But I'm not sure about that. I think the best advice will probably be to speak to a tax expert like an auditor, as an example.
Dr. Solomons, okay, most of the tax relief that SARS has given, you have to be fully tax compliant. Otherwise, you can't apply for the relief. So what happens is if you just take advantage of the measures they've given, they're going to charge you interest because you're not compliant. And on old tax debts, they're still going to charge interest. They're not going to stop the interest on everything else. So until you're fully tax compliant, you won't be able to take advantage of that.
Okay, thank you. I trust that answers that question. I have another question from Anonymous. With the state of the world economy presently, stock markets are largely unscathed. would you be inclined to be a seller now?
Yeah, that's a very, very, very difficult question, because that's my job. I'm supposed to look after people's money. Okay, what is happening at the moment is that the financial markets globally have done very, very well the last couple of months. And it's done very well because of measures that have been put in place. Things like, for example, very low interest rates, and there's massive amounts of money that has been pushed into the financial markets by the Federal Reserve in the US and other central banks, and also by certain fiscal policies that have been put in place. I think the answer to that is that yes, I think the financial markets are a little bit on the expensive side. Not all of them. The South African market, I guess, provides a lot of value still, but some of them certainly are on the high side, and I am concerned about that. But I can tell you one thing, I'm not going to enter into a fight with the Fed in the US. I think the Fed is far too strong. The Fed is called the so-called Fed put. And I think the financial markets will keep on doing well, even though the world economy is in a recession. Remember, financial markets can go up even if the economies go down. So the best advice to that is that get a good asset manager to put a portfolio together that address these sort of concerns that you have. And it is possible to still be in a financial market, but to try to mitigate some of these potential risks that are there. And what we try to do in our instance, for example, we've got a defensive kind of portfolios that we are managing. And defensive portfolios still mean that we still want to participate on the financial markets to get the potential upside. But if there's some sort of correction in the world financial markets, the downside will be limited as well. So I guess the answer to that is get a good asset manager.
Thank you. We've got a question from Dr. Ferry. If state spending is such an issue, why is a potential bailout for SAA still a possibility?
The best I can do to answer that question is to grab my head like this, because I don't have an answer to that. We have had more than 10 final bailout attempts of South African Airways, final plans. This is another final plan. Let me maybe look at it slightly different. And I've mentioned that the South African government is a hugely destructive force in South Africa. Why is that so? And I think people like, for example, Pravin Gordhan, which is a part of all of this, and I think he should be blamed for much of this, but I don't think he had his hand in a cookie jar. I think in his heart, he's a good guy. He's a good communist. So ideologically, he believes in socialism. But what he misses is that most of the ANC and most of the tripartite alliance, they don't care about ideology. They don't care about the national democratic revolution or socialism or exploitation or unemployment. They only care about one thing, and that's living off the state. And that's what this huge patronage is about. It is living off the state, and it's simple as that. And I think that's the reason why they keep on force feeding Eskom and South African Airways and the like. Because if you stop doing that, then you're undermining the reason for the existence of the tripartite alliance, and that is their dependence on the state. They're simply living off the state. And I think there's some value in this answer. But the answer they're going to give you is because we need an airline for some strategic reason, which is just a silly idea. We need an airline for job creation or whatever. But the reality is they've made a massive mess of South African Airways and most of the other state-owned enterprises. And I guess and I don't have an answer to that. In the case of South African Airways, this is very interesting to understand this. So South African Airways, there's a business plan that has been approved. It has been approved. And the Minister of Finance and Minister of State-owned Enterprises both signed a document saying that they will source the funding for South African Airways. And that's why I say we're going to see within days something happening. And that the Minister of Finance can only provide the money if there's some sort of additional budget that needs to go through Parliament, and that takes a lot of time. He did indicate he's not going to make use of his emergency powers because the DA is threatening to take him to court. But he says he's going to make use of other sources, and nobody knows where that is. And I don't know where he's going to get the money from. But I can't answer that. We've got a government that keep on making the same mistake, and even if they succeed in getting money from somewhere and create a new South African Airways, that one will be will be a disaster as well. So yeah, that's the answer. Grabbing my head.
Grabbing your head. Another question, Davi. What about the sovereign fund when the government controls it? What is the effect?
In fact, we have, what is a sovereign fund? A sovereign fund is a fund that belongs to the sovereign. And in the case of a monarchy, the sovereign, of course, is the king or the queen. And in the case of a democracy like South Africa, the sovereign is the country or the state. And we have a number of sovereign funds in South Africa. The PIC, or the Public Investment Commissioner, in a way can be seen as a sovereign fund because they run the government employment pension fund. So that's a sovereign fund. The road accident fund is a sovereign fund. It belongs to the state. Or the unemployment insurance fund is a sovereign fund. But for some, so we have a number of sovereign funds. They're very badly managed, one should add, but we have a number of sovereign funds. But now that just goes to show the quality of our political leadership with the kind of silly ideas that they have. We're currently running with a fiscal deficit of approximately 15% of GDP. We've got state debt levels that is completely getting out of hand. Now they want to create another fund that is probably going to be invested somewhere internationally, which obviously, I don't know where the money is going to come from. So it's a stupid idea. The idea with the sovereign fund initially came from countries like, for example, certain Nordic countries that had some sort of surplus. So you discover a lot of oil and you sell some of your oil, so you have a surplus, and you put some of this money into some sort of fund for future use for your children or whatever the case might be. We do not have any kind of surplus. So we're not going to get a sovereign fund if that is what they mean with a sovereign fund. So no,
Okay.
I don't know where to get that.
Okay, we've got quite a couple of questions to go through, so I'm going to push.
Yeah, sure.
If we borrow from the IMF and are not able to pay back the amount, what are the consequences?
Well, the consequences are not really that much. Some of the consequences, and it's not, if you want to borrow money, it's better to borrow from the IMF instead from the international capital markets, because the international capital markets is that you're borrowing from the private sector, and they've got a nasty habit of taking your ships if they leave your South African waters, and there are many examples of that. They can actually take your embassy in London if you don't pay your money back. So they have there are some examples of that. But if you borrow from the IMF and you can't repay the borrowing from the IMF, then not really much is going to happen. The worst thing that can happen is that you can't borrow more from the IMF or institutions like, for example, the World Bank. They won't come into South Africa and take something from us.
Okay, thank you. Then I've got another question. Who do you think would be competent to take over as a leader of the current government, seeing that the ANC are not going to lose the leadership of the country soon?
So is that a question of who within the ANC should take over?
Who do you think would be competent? It's just not specified, just who do you think would be competent to take over?
Okay, within
as a leader of the current government, in other words, within the ANC, yeah.
Within the ANC. Now, there's a guy that I really like, and his name is Tito Mboweni. Now, Tito Mboweni is a bit of a maverick. I know him personally. I've had a couple of nice, very expensive brandies with him, and he's really a nice guy. He understands the financial markets. His experience as governor of the South African Reserve Bank will come in very, very handy. And the kind of things that he's been saying as the Minister of Finance are the kind of things that we need to do. And I don't believe he's going to be allowed to do these sort of things. And perhaps I should make the comment, I don't think Tito Mboweni is going to be around that much longer, because he's simply going to say, listen, I'm giving up. I'm rather going to look after my avos. But if there's somebody that I want to pick, it certainly will be Tito Mboweni. I like him. As he's probably the best within the ANC, the best in cabinet to be the president. Some other potential candidates are certainly people like, for example, the governor of the South African Reserve Bank. Of course, he's not in politics, but if he could be available, that's another excellent guy. But in cabinet at the moment, there's only one candidate, and that is Tito Mboweni.
Sure, I've got two questions along the same line. It says, if the economy is going downhill, with the end result of all my hard work and pension being stolen by a corrupt government, is it really worth it to stay in South Africa with my family?
Of course it is. Of course it is worth staying in South Africa. Now, let me give you a number. I did mention earlier that if you want to lend money to the German government, you have to pay the Germans before they take your money. If you want to lend money to the South African government, they will pay you 10% if they borrow money from you. So that's the gap. You can get 10% in South Africa or nothing in Germany, or in fact below nothing. And that's an indication of the underlying potential returns that you can get in South Africa. So there's a lot of opportunities. Don't make any mistake. And remember, the world economy is changing. It's changing into the tertiary sectors. It's becoming more service orientated. It's becoming more technological. So the answer is look for opportunities in South Africa and exploit those opportunities. Stay safe personally. Make sure you have the skills and make sure you have a proper connection. But very importantly, take a large chunk of your investments abroad. So a part of your portfolio should be invested abroad. It doesn't matter where you are. I've been in London. I've been in New York the end of last year. And I Skyped in with my team and I spoke to my team and I didn't even realize that I wasn't even in the country. Now that's an example. I visited Dr. Neil earlier this week, and he can take an X-ray around my head and he can email that to a specialist anywhere in the world, and you can be anywhere in the world. So that, I don't think that's correct. I don't think that's really is a valid question in a modern economy in which we find ourselves today.
Okay, thank you. I guess your answer would be positive here because it's in line with what you answered. It says, Darby, would your advice for our parents who are pensioners be that the best place to secure their investments would be to place the money overseas?
Yes. But again, it depends on individual to individual. Say, for instance, if an old lady comes to me and she's got R1 million available and that's all she's got, I'm not going to take that overseas. I'm going to keep it in the South African money market fund as an example. But if that old lady, if a grandson inherits R1 million, I will certainly encourage him to take the money abroad. So it depends from individual to individual. But the answer to that is try to get a relatively large chunk of your portfolio invested abroad.
Right. I have two positive comments, and they say thank you for an informative presentation and excellent. Dawie Rood for president. So I want to say another one, just out of interest, do you have a relationship with the current government in terms of advising them financially?
Okay, that's actually a very nice question. Thank you for that question, because let me explain to you how economists work, how analysts work. Now, analysts or economists, there's a network. We talk to one another all the time. Economists, by the way, are very humble people. We consider ourselves a little bit above the rest of the world. I think we look at people like you clever people looking into petri dishes, looking at bacteria. We're looking at people pretty much the same. So economists, they talk to one another. We are on WhatsApp groups. We call one another, and we are invited to join to the South African Reserve Bank quite often. And the South African Reserve Bank, the doors are really open. It's very, very transparent and very accessible, the Reserve Bank. That used to be the case with government as well. What will happen typically, or what used to happen, I will make a comment on the newspapers, and one of my colleagues will give me a call or send me an SMS and say, listen, that was an unfair comment because I didn't consider this or whatever. Maybe I should fix that or rectify that. Or I will get an email from the Reserve Bank saying maybe what should we talk about that, whatever, and nothing aggressive, nothing. It's a nice network of analysts, and even I can remember there was a time when I even got a message from the president's office when I said something. So there was this behind the scenes network of economists and analysts talking to one another all the time. Now, what I've just said to you tonight on this webinar, I did say that the South African government is a destructive force that's done immense damage to the South African economy. And it's not only me saying that, many other private sector economists and analysts are saying exactly the same. And the really bad part is I don't get a call from government anymore. So not only do we have a destructive government that's doing immense damage to the economy, they also do not have any shame. They don't care what we think of them.
Sure. That's quite concerning. Dave, we've got another question. Why must medical businesses pay VAT? It's like taxing people more on their ill health.
Yes. Okay, let me give you the theory behind that. The theory behind that is that the tax system, one of the requirements of a good tax system is a tax system that must be neutral. A neutral tax system means that you shouldn't encourage people or discourage people to do stuff. That means do not allow for any exceptions. So that is the answer to that. Do not allow for any exceptions, whether that is education, whether that is for medical services or anything good. because it complicates the system. You create opportunity for misuse of the system, for corruption and all of that. So that is the theoretical answer to that. And apart from that, of course, we need the money.
Okay, no exemption for us there. And then I've got Dr. Yunus Sidat. Thank you, Davi, for your insight. It's understandable that you're advising your clients to move investments offshore. But won't all this money leaving exacerbate the problem? What advice can you give us to turn the economic supertanker around and to make South Africa work?
Okay, there are two questions there. The first one is, why do I do this? And that's a bit of an ideological question. When there was a time when we could fly still, and if you remember when we could fly before we take off, the hostess will tell you when something goes wrong, all these things will fall out from the roof. And they also advise you to put this on before you assist children or somebody else. And that's my ideology. I believe that you can only help somebody else if you can help yourself first. And that means that you have to look after yourself, you have to look after your business, and make sure that you make a success of whatever your career is. And remember, this thing, a country doesn't exist. It's simply an agreement between individuals. And the same goes for companies and so on. I don't want to go there, but the bottom line is that you're responsible for yourself first of all. And that's why I advise my clients first, because my clients are more important to me than the country. And I tell my clients, and I analyze the stuff that I do, and I advise my clients to take the money out. But of course, that will exacerbate things. But what's my alternative? Should I tell my clients to keep on giving money to South African Airways? I don't think that's good advice. And anyway, if we take the money out and take it take it away from the grasp of politicians, eventually they will be forced to do the right things. And it makes me think of that one quote from Winston Churchill, where he said, you can always expect the Americans to do the right thing after they've exhausted all the alternatives. So that's what I'm trying to do. I want to force them to do the right thing. So that's the first question, why, and it is exacerbating the problem. What can we do to fix the South African economy? There are many things that we can do. But in the current environment, what we need to do, we need to figure out who's in charge. We don't have an economic problem, really. We've got a political issue. So we need to figure out who's in charge, because we don't know. We have to understand what the ideology is of the tripartite alliance. We don't understand that. And we have to do something about this toxic relationship between organized labor and especially the government, the ANC specifically. And once we fix that, we can start looking at it.
Good, good. I think we can rush just the last few questions. Dr. Meyer wants to know, where is all the money that was not spent the past few months? Don't know what money is referring to, but probably
that is a very, very complicated question. Remember, money doesn't mean anything. Money only means something if you can do something with that. And you can ask the Zimbabweans, they've got a lot of money, but you can't do anything with that because they've got hyperinflation. So remember, let me try to answer this in a quick way. For 3 months, we've closed down the economy. People did not produce anything. And if you don't produce anything, then of course the money is not there. Or actually the other way around. Look at money as a form of previous production. And if you close down the production side of the economy, then there simply isn't money. So it's not as if the money disappeared, it's more of a matter of wealth that was not produced. And if wealth is not produced, then of course there's not money, because money or wealth is represented by what we call money today. I'll try to do that, try to answer that question.
Sure.
Yes.
One quick last question, probably another 2 more. How soon can the government get their hands on private annuities? That comes from Dr. Lawrence Stapelberg.
It will take some time. It's not easy to do that. It will take some time. I think mostly at risk will be the government employment pension fund. But eventually, what is good for the goose is good for the gander. And what will eventually happen is legislation will be changed to apply that if there's prescribed assets to the other pension funds and other forms of saving as well. That has not been proposed yet, and there will be huge opposition to that. So this is not going to be a fight that's going to be won that easily. Although the administrative process is relatively easy, I am very sure that there will be many, many institutions that's going to try to oppose possible changes.
One last question, Darby. Are we on the road to moving towards a nationalistic government in South Africa following the world trend?
Well, we have that in a way. And remember, nationalism can take, and this is a bit of a philosophical question, I guess. Nationalism can be a left kind of nationalism, or it can be a right kind of nationalism. A good example of a right-wing kind of nationalism I guess, is what we see today. I guess in the United States, that's an example of that. While a left nationalism is a socialist kind of government or a fascist kind of government. What we have in South Africa is certainly a version of nationalism, but it's a socialist kind of nationalism. And what differs from the South African nationalism, typically what you would find quite often in nationalism, and a very good example is North Korea, that is very much a fascist kind of nationalism, but that's a nationalism that is based on race, as an example, in North Korea. We don't have that necessarily in South Africa, but we certainly have nationalism in the sense that we have a government that wants to control everything, and their ideological beliefs are socialist, communist. And I guess from that point of view, we can talk about South Africa being a nationalist country, becoming more so.
Thank you, Darby, for all the questions answered. Thank you to all the participants for your participation. I'm going to hand over now to Dr. Irshad Asmal, and he's just going to be saying and expressing appreciation to our excellent speaker. As one of the comments said, it said, "8 flippin' stekend." Thank you very much.
Dr. Solomons,
Dr. Asmal.
Can I just say something? If anybody's interested in receiving my my newsletters, you're more than welcome to send me an email, and you can provide the email address to them and send me an email, and I put you on my distribution list, and it's free, gratis, and for need.
Oh, very many thanks. Dr. Asmal?
Yes. Hello, everybody. Can everyone hear me? Hi, Mr. Rudd. Thank you so much for that insightful lecture. It was really, I know I can now stop packing my suitcase to flee the country. So thank you very much. It was very positive news to hear from you. I think a lot of us appreciated hearing about what's the current state of the economy of the country. And to all the attendees as well for here, I see there's about close to 500. That's about the population of Algoa Midlands. So that's awesome. Thank you very much. Once the webinar is over, please join us for some free snacks in your kitchen. That's sponsored by yourselves. But thank you so much, Mr. Rudd, and thank you for sharing your knowledge with us and letting us pick your brain for a little bit and for an hour or so. Thank you so much.
Absolute pleasure. Thank you, Dr. Ismail.
Thank you very much, Dr. Asmal. I'm now coming to make some closing remarks. I think, Mr. Rudd, you can probably excuse yourself. The closing remarks and announcements is, I just want to tell you about the next SADA webinars. On Monday, the 27th of August, Dr. Bradley Bredenkamp, sponsored by Mundi Pharma, on oral disinfection and COVID. What does the literature say? Tuesday, the 28th of August, SADA Free State branch with Dr. Oderile Molloy on clinical tips on how to manage premolars with complex root canal treatment, root canal anatomy. Thursday, 30th of August, SADA Pretoria branch will have Dr. Everett Berger on less is more approach. How does this change clinical decision-making and also career and personal decisions? And coming soon, the date is to be confirmed, we will have a CBCT webinar with Dr. Dale Miles from the USA entitled CBCT Imaging, More Than 50 Shades of Gray. So finally, Mr. Darby Rudd, thank you so much again. Thank you to the listeners for joining, and thank you Vartec and SciVision, Vartec South Africa, for sponsoring this excellent presentation tonight. So we're going to end this webinar with a 60-second intro to the Vartec imaging product range. And as we say good night, we will see you again soon. Wherever you are, keep safe.
We are the leading producer of dental imaging devices in the world. We We are the only manufacturer that designs and produces all essential parts of the dental imaging system, including software. Our dedication to improving lives through technology led us to innovations the world has never seen. The world's safest CBCT, the Smart CT, which captures 2D and 3D images simultaneously, flexible and painless intraoral digital sensors, and the world's lightest intraoral portable X-ray. Distinct in their own ways, but one goal remains. A better life. We promise. Providing technologies inspired by you, outstanding quality, and the service second to none. This is our commitment to you.